Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going way back to the early 1900s to try and figure out this guy, Syd
Oh,
Jones.
this is a fascinating one. Yeah, Syd Jones. Now, all we really have is his Wikipedia page and some old newspaper articles
Hmm.
from around 1915 when he was executed.
Okay, so right off the bat, what makes this case so interesting to me is that Jones himself claimed to be a serial killer. He actually confessed to 13 murders right before
Wow.
execution.
See, and that's the thing with this case. There's just so much we don't know about him.
Right.
We don't even know when he was born. It's
Yeah.
like he just kind of popped up out of nowhere, committed these awful crimes, and they disappeared back into the shadows.
It really does feel like we're working with like a puzzle, with half the pieces missing.
Yeah.
But from what we can tell, his murders supposedly happened all over the country, and he had all sorts of victims. Like, we're talking fellow convicts,
Yeah.
law enforcement, even just everyday people.
Right, and that's what really stands out, doesn't it? I mean, was there some kind of pattern to his victims? Or was it all just random?
Yeah, like, what does that tell us about his motives?
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of figuring out his motives, what do we actually know about this guy's early life?
Well, not a whole lot, to be honest. It seems like he might have been from Alabama, and he served in the 10th Cavalry Regiment.
The military connection is interesting, especially because if we believe his confession, one of his victims was Deputy Sheriff W.S. Mosley in Monterey, California.
Yeah, now whether the detail is completely accurate is up for debate, but it does make you think, did his time in the military somehow influence his later actions?
I mean, could it have desensitized him to violence? Or maybe he was carrying some kind of unresolved trauma from his service. I think that's worth looking into.
For sure. And if we move forward a bit in the timeline, we come to Jones being imprisoned for the alleged murder of Mosley. Now, he was already serving a life sentence when he killed again, this time another inmate, most likely a man named Cleve Waters.
So, wait. He's already in prison for life, and he commits another murder. That doesn't seem logical, unless... Hold on. Was this maybe like a calculated move to get himself on death row?
That's a good question, right? Like, did he prefer a quicker execution rather than wasting away in prison? Or was there something else driving him, something totally different?
It's like we're trying to get inside the mind of someone who is seriously disturbed, you know?
Absolutely. And then comes the day of his execution. Just as the guards are approaching his cell, they find a note, a confession, to 13 murders.
Wow. Talk about a last-minute revelation.
Right.
I mean, what do you think was going through his mind at that point? Was he trying to exert some kind of control, even as he's about to die?
It's possible, right? He's facing the ultimate loss of control, his own death. So by confessing, he gets to shape the story, leave behind a certain image.
He's not just Syd Jones the prisoner, he's Syd Jones the serial killer.
Exactly.
But then that raises even more questions. I mean, what was the point of the confession? Was it just guilt, or was he trying to make sense of his actions? Or, like you said, was it all about power?
It really is a fascinating and kind of disturbing contradiction.
For sure. And to make things even more complicated, he lists all these victims in his confession. This whole web of violence stretching across who knows how many states.
Right. We got 2 unnamed convicts in Alabama, then Cleve Waters, the guy he killed in prison, and then it just keeps going. A bunch of murders in Nebraska, then California, Kentucky, back to Alabama, even Wyoming.
Okay, but what gets me is how different all the locations are. This wasn't just one killing spree in one place. It was all over. Was he running from the law, constantly trying to stay one step ahead? Or was there some other reason he kept moving?
That's a good point, right? It definitely seems more planned out than just random acts of violence. Makes you think if there was something connecting all these places, something that drew him to each one.
Right. It's like some kind of morbid road trip with every stop marking another chapter in his messed up story.
Exactly. And to top it all off, he even mentions a failed murder attempt on someone named Richard Moore back in 1912. And get this, he actually expresses regret for not adding another victim to his list.
That's chilling. To think that taking a life was like a goal for him?
It really shows you how twisted his thinking was.
Yeah.
And this guy was just one of 3 convicts who were hanged in Alabama on June 25, 1915. It's hard to even grasp the enormity of the crimes that day.
Absolutely. So let's dig into the confession itself and see if we can separate fact from fiction and figure out what really happened with Syd Jones.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so we've got this confession, right? A list of 13 supposed murders. But as we know, things aren't always what they seem. One of the weirdest parts of this case is the alleged murder of W.S. Mosley in Nebraska. Remember how we talked about Jones's military connection?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, get this. After Jones was executed, the Crawford Police Department actually contacted a newspaper to dispute some of the stuff in his confession.
Really? So they're saying he was lying? I mean, the guy's already been executed.
Yeah.
What's the point of making stuff up at that stage?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Well, it might not be about intentionally lying, you know?
Hmm.
Maybe it's more like a messed up memory. We're talking about a guy who could have been really unstable mentally, and time can do crazy things to your memories.
Okay, that makes sense. So what was the police's side of the story? How did it differ from what Jones said?
Well, they said the victim wasn't Mosley. It was a guy named Art Moss. And the killing didn't happen like Jones said. It went down during a huge riot with soldiers from the 10th Cavalry.
Whoa, a riot.
Yeah.
That changes things completely. It makes you wonder if Jones was trying to make himself sound tougher,
Yeah.
embellishing his role to seem more dangerous.
That's definitely a possibility. But let's break down the riot itself because it gives you a glimpse into how wild things could get back then. Apparently, some soldiers from the 10th Cavalry had it out for the Moss brothers. Maybe it started with a horse race they lost or something.
So they start a whole riot over a horse race. Geez, talk about holding a grudge.
Right. Sounds crazy now, but things were different back then. Anyway, one Sunday evening, these soldiers are getting drunk and causing all kinds of trouble in town. Art Moss, who's filling in as Marshall tried to step in and calm things down.
Oh, I bet that didn't go over well.
Nope. They shot and killed Art Moss, and that's when everything went haywire. A bunch of people from town, furious and wanting revenge, chased after the soldiers. They killed one and captured another.
So we got a riot, a shootout, and a mob chasing soldiers. It's like something out of an old Western.
You got it. And it gets even crazier. The rest of the soldiers, trying to get their buddy back, tried to break into the jail. It turned into this huge standoff with the guards.
Wow, they weren't messing around. This whole thing just keeps escalating. It shows how quickly things could spiral out of control back then.
For sure. And sadly, an innocent bystander, a guy named Phil Murphy, got caught in the crossfire and was killed. It's a reminder that violence can hit anyone, even those who have nothing to do with it.
That's awful, and it makes this whole mess even more complicated. So do we know if Jones was one of the soldiers who shot Art Moss?
The police thought so. They found records putting a guy named Jones with the 10th Cavalry at the time, which matches up with his confession, even though some details are off.
So he might have been part of the riot, even if he didn't kill Art Moss himself. But why would he lie about that?
Maybe he felt some kind of loyalty to his fellow soldiers, you know? Like he wanted to share in their infamy. Or maybe he just wanted to tell a more exciting story, make it more sensational.
It's like he wanted to be this ultimate outlaw, someone who broke all the rules and lived by his own code.
And that desire for attention could explain his deathbed confession too. Maybe he saw it as a way to cement his legacy, to be remembered as a notorious criminal.
Yeah, that's an interesting link. It's like he was creating his own legend, even if it was a really dark one.
Exactly. This case really shows how hard it is to separate truth from lies, especially when we're dealing with events that happened so long ago and unreliable sources.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing. We have these bits and pieces of information, but the whole picture is still unclear.
Exactly. And that brings us to the other murders in Jones's confession. We don't know a lot about some of those victims, so it's hard to even confirm if those murders actually happened.
So we're left with this weird mix of confirmed facts and unanswered questions. On one hand, we know he killed at least 2 people in prison. On the other hand, the details of the other supposed murders are pretty shaky.
It all comes down to that confession note. What was he really trying to do? Was he being honest? Or was it some kind of twisted game?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Man, it's wild that we can look at all these details, these little pieces of information, and we're still left with more questions than answers.
It really is.
It says a lot about how complex people are, especially someone like Syd Jones.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. It's not just about a bunch of crimes. It's about trying to understand a guy who confesses to those crimes on the day he's going to be hanged. I mean, what was he thinking? Was it just a guilty conscience?
I don't know about that. If he really felt bad, why wait till the very last second? It feels like there's got to be more to it. Like maybe he wanted to control the story, even in death.
That's a good point, right? You know, they say people sometimes make deathbed confessions when they're facing the end, like they need to get things off their chest. But with Jones, it's almost like he was trying to create his own legacy with this confession.
Yeah, like he wouldn't just be another forgotten convict. He'd be remembered as Syd Jones, the serial killer. Kind of messed up when you think about it.
Definitely. And we can't forget about the time period either.
Yep.
The early 1900s were a whole different world. Newspapers loved sensational stories, and people ate up tales of crime and violence.
So you're saying the media back then could have influenced Jones's confession? Like he knew his story would be big news.
It's not impossible, right? He's about to die, his life is over. But if he confesses to all these awful things, his name will live on, at least as a notorious criminal.
It's a weird kind of immortality, I guess. But even if he was looking for fame, we still got to figure out if any of it was true. Like we said, there are holes in his story and not everything adds up.
Exactly. And that's where the real mystery is. Was he exaggerating some things, making stuff up entirely, or was he really a cold-blooded killer who went after innocent people?
It's a puzzle we might never solve. But the whole process of looking at the evidence, thinking about the time period, and trying to understand his motives, that's what makes this case so fascinating.
You know, it reminds me of something Truman Capote said. He said he always wanted to write a novel that was both factual and poetic. And in a way, that's what we're doing with Syd Jones. We're taking these bits of fact and speculation and weaving them together to try and make a story that's both informative and captivating.
That's a great way to put it. And in the end, I think it's up to each of us to decide what we believe about Syd Jones. Was he a monster? Just a troubled guy looking for attention? A product of his time? Maybe a little bit of everything.
For sure. We've laid out the facts, looked at the different possibilities, and now it's your turn to make up your own mind.
So there you have it, folks. The strange and unsettling case of Syd Jones, a man who confessed to being a serial killer right before he was executed. We may never know the whole truth, but the questions his story raises about why people do what they do, about guilt and the need for recognition, those are things that stick with us long after he's gone.
And maybe that's the most important thing we can take away from this. It's a reminder that even the simplest cases can be super complicated and full of twists and turns. And sometimes the most interesting mysteries are the ones we never quite solve.
Thanks for joining us on this trip back in time. We encourage you to dig deeper into this case, look into the history, and come to your own conclusions. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.